You weren't abandoned. You were kept in a state where you always believed that if you just gave a little more, understood a little deeper, stayed a little longer, then this time things would finally settle into something real, something stable, something you could trust. But the truth is they were never fully there to begin with. And that is what drained you, not their absence, but their pattern of returning just enough to keep you from leaving. You have felt this before, that moment when things start to feel close, when conversations get deeper, when their energy softens and you begin to think maybe this is it, maybe this time it is different, maybe this time they are choosing you in the same way you are choosing them. And just when that feeling begins to grow, just when you start to relax into it, they pull back, not loudly, not dramatically, just distance, silence, a shift you cannot fully explain. And suddenly you are left trying to understand what changed. So you go back, you replay everything, every message, every tone, every moment, searching for the exact point where you might have said too much or not enough, where you might have pushed or hesitated, because your mind needs a reason. It needs something to hold on to, but you never really find it because the truth is there was nothing you did wrong. There was only a pattern you could not see while you were inside it. And then just as you begin to let go, just as you slowly start to accept that they are gone, they come back as if nothing happened, as if the silence did not exist. And suddenly you are pulled right back in, not because you are weak, but because you are invested, because you remember how it felt when it was good and you believe that version is still possible. And that belief is what keeps you there. This is where it becomes dangerous because you are no longer responding to reality. You are responding to potential, to a version of them that only appears in moments, to a future that feels close enough to touch but never actually arrives. And the more you invest in that future, the harder it becomes to step away from it. You tell yourself they just need time, that they are dealing with something, that if you are patient enough, they will eventually meet you where you are. So you adjust, you become easier, quieter, less demanding. You stop asking questions that might push them away. You start accepting things you once would not tolerate. And you call it understanding, you call it growth, but deep down you feel the imbalance. You feel it in the silence. You do not question. In the distance, you pretend not to notice. In the way you start shrinking your own needs just to keep the connection from breaking. And without realizing it, you are teaching them something. You are teaching them that they can leave without losing you, that they can return without changing, that your presence is not something they have to earn. It is something they can always come back to. And over time, that gap grows, the gap between what you feel and what you receive, between what you give and what is returned. But you stay because leaving does not feel like walking away from a relationship. It feels like walking away from a possibility, from a version of the story that never fully had the chance to exist. And letting go of that feels harder than holding on. But here is the part that is difficult to accept. You are not stuck because you love them too much. You are stuck because you are inside a system that keeps you emotionally engaged. A system where closeness is followed by distance, where certainty is replaced with doubt, where your mind is constantly trying to resolve something that never fully settles. And maybe the hardest truth is this: you are not trying to hold on to them. You are trying to hold on to how they made you feel in the moments when everything seemed real, when you felt chosen, when you felt seen, when you felt like it was finally working. And once you see that clearly, everything begins to shift. Because the question is no longer why they act this way. The question becomes why you continue to stay in something that never gives you enough to feel secure, but always gives you just enough to keep you from leaving. It never starts with distance. It starts with closeness. That is what makes the loop so hard to recognize, because in the beginning, everything feels right. They are present, attentive, curious about you. They ask questions, they lean in, they create a sense of connection that feels rare, almost too rare. Like you have finally found someone who sees you in a way most people do not. And for you, that is everything, because you are not just looking for attention, you are looking for depth, for something that feels real beneath the surface. And just when you begin to settle into that feeling, just when your guard starts to drop, something shifts, not all at once, but enough for you to notice. Their replies get shorter, the energy changes, the consistency fades, and suddenly you are the one reaching out more, the one trying to keep the rhythm alive, the one holding on to something that used to flow naturally. So you tell yourself it is temporary. You tell yourself they are just busy, stressed, dealing with something you cannot see. And instead of pulling back, you lean in harder, you give more, you become more patient, more understanding. You try to stabilize something that is already starting to slip. And this is where the loop begins to form, because the more they withdraw, the more you move closer, and the more you move closer, the more they feel the need to pull away. And then comes the silence, not complete disappearance, but enough space to make you question everything. Hours turn into days, conversations feel unfinished, and your mind does not rest. It replays, it analyzes, it searches for meaning in every small detail. You start wondering if you said something wrong, if you were too much, if you moved too fast, if you should have waited, if you should have been quieter, easier, less intense. You begin to overthink things that once felt natural. You question your own instincts, your own reactions, your own needs, and slowly, without realizing it, you shift the focus inward, not in a healthy way, but in a way that turns you into the problem solver of something you did not create. And then just as the confusion starts to turn into emotional exhaustion, they come back casually, effortlessly, as if the distance never happened. They reconnect, they re-engage. They bring back that same warmth, that same attention that made you feel seen in the first place. And your body responds immediately, not because you forgot what happened, but because you remember how it felt when it was good. And in that moment, the relief is so strong that it overrides everything else. You stop questioning, you stop analyzing, you just feel grateful that they are back, grateful that the connection is still there. And that relief reinforces the cycle, because now your mind associates their return with emotional reward. So the pattern repeats: closeness, distance, silence, return. And every time it happens, it pulls you deeper, not because you are unaware, but because each phase creates a different emotional state inside you. And those states start to define your experience. When they are close, you feel calm, connected, almost certain that this is leading somewhere real. When they pull away, you feel anxious, unsettled, searching for stability. When they go silent, you feel confused, questioning your own worth, your own actions. And when they return, you feel relief, a temporary sense of validation that makes everything feel okay again. But that relief does not come from resolution. It comes from contrast. It feels intense because it follows uncertainty. And over time, your system starts to crave that cycle, not consciously, but neurologically, because your emotions are being pulled between opposite states again and again. And this is where self-blame starts to take hold, because you are trying to make sense of something that was never stable to begin with. You think if you can just figure it out, just adjust a little more, just understand them better, then you can break the pattern. But every adjustment you make pulls you deeper into it. You start saying less, feeling more, questioning everything. And the person you were at the beginning, open, expressive, certain of your value, slowly fades into someone who is constantly adapting, constantly monitoring, constantly trying to maintain something that never stays consistent. And the hardest part is that from the outside, nothing looks obviously wrong. There is no clear ending, no clear rejection, no moment where you can say this is over. And that is exactly what keeps you there, because you are not dealing with loss, you are dealing with uncertainty. And uncertainty keeps hope alive longer than anything else. So you stay not because you are weak, but because you are caught in a loop that keeps giving you just enough to continue, just enough connection to believe, just enough distance to chase, just enough silence to question, and just enough return to reset everything. And the longer you stay in that loop, the harder it becomes to separate what you feel from what is actually happening, because your emotions are no longer responding to reality. They are responding to a pattern that was never designed to give you stability, only to keep you engaged. it feels personal. That is the first mistake your mind makes. It feels like something about you is causing this pattern. Like if you were different, calmer, less emotional, more understanding, then they would stay, then things would stabilize, then this cycle would finally stop. But what you are experiencing is not random, and it is not unique to just this one person. It is a dynamic, a system that forms when two specific patterns meet. And once you see it clearly, you realize it was never just about them, and it was never just about you. It was about how both of you are wired to respond to connection itself. On one side, you have someone who craves closeness, not in a superficial way, but in a deep, almost instinctive way. You are drawn to emotional depth, to meaning, to understanding people beyond what they show on the surface. Connection for you is not optional. It is something that gives you a sense of purpose, something that makes you feel alive. And because of that, when you feel it with someone, you do not approach it cautiously. You move toward it, you invest in it, you try to grow it. On the other side, you have someone who also wants connection, but experiences it very differently. For them, closeness does not just feel good, it also feels overwhelming, because the moment things start to get real, the moment emotional intimacy begins to deepen, something in their system reacts, not consciously, not in a way they can easily explain, but in a way that creates distance, space, a need to pull back. So in the beginning, everything works because at the start, connection is light. It is easy. It does not feel threatening. They can engage, they can show interest, they can meet you in that space. But as things deepen, as the connection becomes more real, more consistent, more emotionally demanding, their system starts to interpret it as pressure, not because you are doing something wrong, but because closeness itself activates something they have not learned how to regulate. And this does not come from nowhere. It is not something that appeared randomly in adulthood. It is something that was formed much earlier in environments where emotional safety was inconsistent, where closeness was not always predictable, where being open did not always lead to being met in a stable way. And over time, the mind learns to associate intimacy with risk, with loss of control, with the possibility of being overwhelmed. So when things start to feel too close, too real, too emotionally intense, the reaction is not to lean in. It is to create space, to regain a sense of control. And that is why the withdrawal feels so sudden to you, because from your perspective, everything was building towards something deeper, while from their perspective, everything was starting to feel like too much. And this is where your pattern meets theirs, because when they pull away, your instinct is not to step back. Your instinct is to move closer, to understand, to fix, to stabilize. Because for you, distance does not feel safe. Distance feels like disconnection, like something is wrong, like something needs to be repaired. And the more you feel that distance, the more your system activates. So now both of you are reacting not to each other directly, but to what the situation triggers inside you. They feel overwhelmed by closeness, so they create distance. You feel unsettled by distance, so you try to restore closeness. And without realizing it, both of you are reinforcing the exact pattern that keeps repeating. This is not a conscious decision. It is not manipulation in the way people often think. It is a loop created by two nervous systems trying to protect themselves in opposite ways. One protects by pulling away, the other protects by holding on tighter. And when those two strategies meet, the result is instability. And the reason it feels so intense, so hard to walk away from, is because your brain is not just processing emotions, it is responding to unpredictability, to inconsistency. And inconsistency is one of the most powerful drivers of emotional attachment, because when something is unpredictable, your mind pays more attention to it. It tries harder to understand it. It invests more energy into solving it. So every time they come close, your system relaxes. Every time they pull away, your system activates. And that constant shift between relief and tension creates a level of emotional engagement that feels deeper than it actually is. Not because the connection is stronger, but because it is less stable. And this is where confusion turns into attachment, because you are not just connecting with them, you are trying to resolve the pattern, you are trying to find stability inside something that is inherently unstable. And the more effort you put into that, the more invested you become. So when you ask yourself why this keeps happening, why you keep ending up in situations where you feel close one moment and disconnected the next, the answer is not that you are choosing the wrong people randomly. It is that your system is drawn to something familiar, something that feels like connection, but also activates the need to earn it, to maintain it, to work for it. And once you understand that, once you see that, this is not just about them being inconsistent or you being too emotional, but about a deeper pattern where both sides are reacting in ways that keep the cycle alive, you start to realize something uncomfortable but important. This will not change. Just because you try harder, it will not stabilize. Just because you become more understanding, because the pattern itself is not built on misunderstanding. It is built on opposing responses to intimacy. And as long as those responses stay the same, the outcome will stay the same. No matter how much you care, no matter how much you give, no matter how much you hope that this time it will be different. This is the part where most people get it wrong, not because they are not smart enough to see what is happening, but because what they feel is stronger than what they can logically understand. Because from your perspective, the answer seems simple. If you just try a little harder, if you just communicate better, if you just become more patient, more understanding, then eventually the pattern will break. Eventually they will feel safe enough to stay. Eventually all of this inconsistency will turn into something stable. And that belief feels right because it aligns with everything you have learned about love, that love requires effort, that real connection takes work, that people are not perfect and you have to give them space to grow. And you are willing to do that. You are willing to stay through the confusion, through the distance, through the silence, because you believe there is something real underneath it all. But here is the twist that changes everything. You are not actually responding to love. You are responding to a cycle. And that cycle is not building connection. It is building attachment through inconsistency. Because every time they pull away, your system activates, your mind becomes alert, focused, searching. And when they come back, your system relaxes, it releases tension. And that shift from anxiety to relief creates a powerful emotional response inside you, a response that feels like connection, but is actually something else. It is the same mechanism that keeps people hooked on things that are unpredictable, not because those things are good for them, but because they are inconsistent, because the reward is not guaranteed, and that uncertainty makes every positive moment feel more intense, more meaningful, more valuable than it actually is. So when they return after pulling away, it does not just feel like they came back. It feels like you got something back, something you were afraid of losing, something you had been thinking about, analyzing, missing. And that emotional high reinforces the entire pattern because now your brain associates their return with relief, with reward, with something worth holding on to. And this is where the trap becomes invisible. Because from the outside, it looks like you are just trying to make a relationship work. It looks like you are being patient, understanding, committed. But internally, something else is happening. You are being conditioned slowly, repeatedly, to stay engaged in something that never fully stabilizes. You start measuring the relationship not by consistency, but by moments, by how good it feels when they are present, by how intense the connection is when it is there. And those moments become the justification for everything else, for the distance, for the silence, for the confusion, because you believe that if those moments exist, then the relationship has potential. But potential is not reality. And this is where the illusion becomes dangerous. Because you are not investing in what is consistently happening, you are investing in what occasionally appears, and the gap between those two things is what keeps you stuck. You think you are building something, but what you are actually doing is chasing a pattern that never completes itself, because every time it gets close to something real, it resets, it pulls back, it starts over, and you go with it, because you are already invested. And the more you invest, the harder it becomes to step back and see it clearly. Because now leaving does not just mean walking away from them. It means walking away from all the time, the energy, the emotions you have already put into it. It means accepting that what you believed in may not have been real in the way you thought. So instead of leaving, you try harder, you adapt more, you become more understanding, more flexible, more willing to tolerate things you once would not accept, because you believe that effort will eventually lead to stability. But effort does not fix a pattern that is built on inconsistency. It only keeps you inside it longer. And this is why it feels so confusing, because part of you can see that something is not right. Part of you can feel the imbalance, the unpredictability, the emotional ups and downs. But another part of you is holding on to those moments of connection, those glimpses of what it could be, and that internal conflict keeps you from making a clear decision. You are not just choosing between staying or leaving, you are choosing between reality and possibility, between what is consistently happening and what you hope will eventually happen. And as long as possibility feels stronger than reality, you stay. But here is the truth that changes everything. You are not in love with who they are consistently. You are attached to how they make you feel intermittently. And intermittent emotion is one of the strongest forms of attachment, not because it is stable, but because it is unpredictable. And once you see that clearly, once you understand that what feels like deep connection might actually be a response to inconsistency, the entire dynamic starts to shift. Because now you are no longer asking how to make it work, you are asking why it keeps repeating. And that question is dangerous because it does not lead you back into the loop, it leads you out of it. There is always a moment, and it does not look dramatic. It does not arrive with closure or clarity or some final conversation that explains everything. It comes quietly, almost subtly. And if you are not paying attention, you might miss it, because on the surface, nothing really changes. They might still be there, still talking, still coming and going the same way they always have, but something inside you shifts. It usually starts as a question, not a loud one, not something you say out loud, but something that lingers in the background of your thoughts, something that feels different from the questions you used to ask. Because before you were asking, what did I do wrong? What can I do better? How can I make this work? But now the question changes, and once it changes, everything else begins to change with it. So now you start asking, why does this keep happening? Why do I feel anxious more often than I feel secure? Why do I have to adjust so much just to maintain something that should feel natural? And that shift is important because for the first time, your attention is not fully on them. It is starting to turn back toward you. And at first, that realization is uncomfortable. Because it means you have to look at something you have been avoiding, not intentionally, but out of habit. You have to look at your own patterns, your own reactions, your own willingness to stay in something that has been giving you more confusion than clarity. You start to notice things you ignored before, not because they were not there, but because you were focused on the potential. Now you begin to see the reality. You see the inconsistency not as something temporary, but as something repeated. You see the distance not as an exception, but as a pattern. And most importantly, you see how much of yourself you have been adjusting to keep this dynamic alive. And that realization can feel heavy because it challenges the story you have been telling yourself, the story that says, if you just try harder, things will improve, the story that says they will eventually meet you where you are, the story that justifies your patience, your understanding, your effort. But once you see the pattern clearly, those stories start to lose their hold because you cannot unsee what has been consistent all along. You cannot convince yourself that something is temporary when it has happened over and over again. And that is where the shift becomes irreversible. You begin to understand that the problem is not that you are not enough. It is that the dynamic itself was never built to give you what you are looking for. It was built on imbalance, on one person moving closer while the other moves away, on one person trying to stabilize while the other tries to create space. And this is where something important happens. You stop trying to fix it. not out of anger, not out of frustration, but out of clarity, because you realize that no amount of effort can change a pattern that is not based on misunderstanding, but on opposing needs. You start to pull back, not dramatically, not in a way that demands attention, but internally, you stop overanalyzing every message. You stop waiting for their responses to define how you feel. You stop adjusting your behavior just to maintain their presence. And for the first time, you begin to create space inside yourself. That space is unfamiliar at first, because you are used to filling it with thoughts about them, with questions, with emotions, with anticipation. But now there is a pause, a distance that is not coming from them, but from you. And in that space, you begin to feel something different. Not relief immediately, not peace right away, but awareness. Awareness of how much energy you have been giving, how much of your focus has been tied to something that never fully grounded itself. And the awareness changes how you see everything. You begin to notice that what you thought was connection often came with anxiety, that what you thought was depth often came with inconsistency, that what you thought was potential often came with uncertainty. And once you connect those patterns, it becomes harder to justify staying the same way you were before. This does not mean you suddenly detach completely. It does not mean you stop caring overnight, but it does mean that something inside you is no longer willing to ignore what you now understand. And that is the beginning of reclaiming control. Because before, your emotions were reacting to their behavior, to their presence, to their absence. But now your awareness starts to guide your response. You begin to see that you have a choice, not over how they act, but over how you engage with what they do. And that is where the real turning point is. Not when they change, not when the situation resolves itself, but when you realize that your role in this dynamic is something you can step out of, not by forcing them to be different, but by choosing to no longer respond the same way you always have. And once that realization settles in, even quietly, even without a dramatic decision, something fundamental has already changed. Because you are no longer fully inside the loop, part of you has stepped outside of it. And once that happens, the cycle cannot hold you in the same way it did before. This is where most people think the answer is action. They think the solution is to say the right words, to set clear rules, to communicate boundaries in a way that finally makes the other person understand. But what they do not realize is that real power in this situation does not come from what you say, it comes from what you stop doing. Because for so long, your role in this dynamic was not just to participate in the connection, it was to maintain it, to stabilize it, to fill the gaps when things went quiet, to explain when things became unclear, to adjust when things felt off. And without realizing it, you became the one holding everything together while they moved in and out of it. So reclaiming your power does not start with confrontation. It starts with withdrawal, not from them completely, but from the behaviors that kept the pattern alive in the first place. You stop explaining yourself to people who have already decided how they want to see you. You stop over clarifying your intentions just to avoid being misunderstood, because you begin to understand something important. Not everyone misunderstands you by accident. Some people rely on your explanations because it gives them room to avoid accountability. You stop chasing consistency from someone who has shown you they cannot provide it, not because you do not care, but because you realize that chasing something that is not being offered only keeps you stuck in the same position, waiting, adjusting, hoping for a shift that never fully arrives. And this is where silence becomes different. Before, silence felt like loss, like something was wrong, like something needed to be fixed. But now silence becomes a choice, a space you allow instead of something you rush to fill. And in that space, something powerful happens. You start to see people more clearly. When you stop explaining, people reveal what they actually believe. When you stop filling the gaps, people show you how they handle distance. When you stop accommodating, people show you who they are when things are no longer easy for them. And that clarity is uncomfortable at first because it removes the illusion. It takes away the benefit of doubt used to give so freely. And once you see things as they are, you cannot go back to seeing them the way you did before. At the same time, you begin to shift internally, not just in how you interact with them, but in how you relate to your own emotions. Because before, your feelings were reactive They followed their behavior, their presence, their absence, their inconsistency. Now you create a layer of distance between what you feel and how you respond. You still feel everything, the disappointment, the confusion, the pull to go back into the pattern, but you no longer act on it immediately. You pause, you observe, you let the emotion exist without letting it control your next move. And that pause changes everything because it gives you control. Control does not mean you stop caring. It means you choose how you care. You choose where your energy goes. You choose what you engage with and what you step back from. And for the first time, your behavior is not driven by their actions. It is guided by your awareness. You begin to understand that boundaries are not something you say once. They are something you embody consistently. They are reflected in what you tolerate, what you respond to, what you give your time and attention to. And this is where emotional detachment starts to form, not as a defense mechanism that shuts everything down, but as a filter, a way of deciding what enters your emotional space and what does not. You no longer absorb everything automatically. You no longer internalize every shift in their behavior. You recognize what belongs to you and what does not. And that distinction creates stability inside you, even if the situation itself has not changed. From the outside, this may look like you have become distant, less reactive, less emotionally available, and people might notice it. They might ask, what is wrong? Why you are different? Why you do not respond the way you used to? But what has actually changed is not your capacity to feel, it is your willingness to overextend, to give without balance, to stay in something that continuously destabilizes you. And this is the part that feels unfamiliar, because you are no longer trying to control the outcome. You are not trying to make them stay. You are not trying to fix the dynamic. You are allowing things to unfold without forcing them into something they have never been able to sustain. And in that space, you begin to see something clearly. The more you stop over-functioning, the more the imbalance becomes visible. Because without your effort holding everything together, the dynamic either stabilizes on its own or it collapses. And that is the truth most people avoid, because it means accepting that some connections only exist because of how much you are doing to maintain them. But once you reclaim your power, once you stop being the one carrying the weight of something that requires two people to hold, you are no longer dependent on whether it works or not, because your sense of stability is no longer tied to their consistency. It is tied to your own. And that is where everything begins to change. Not because they changed, but because you are no longer participating in the pattern the way you used to. At some point, without a clear announcement, without a final conversation that marks the ending, something inside you settles, not in the way you expected, not in a way that feels like closure, but in a way that feels like quiet certainty, and that certainty does not come from them changing. It comes from you no longer needing them to. You start to notice it in small moments, in the spaces where you would have reacted before, where you would have checked your phone, reread messages, wondered what they were thinking, what they were doing, why they had not responded. And now there is a pause, not forced, not something you have to remind yourself to do, but something natural, something that happens because your mind is no longer orbiting around them the way it used to. You still remember how it felt. You still recognize the connection for what it was, but it no longer has the same pull. It no longer defines your emotional state. And that is when you realize the shift has already happened, not in one big decision, but in a series of smaller moments where you chose not to go back into the same pattern. And what is strange about this phase is that from the outside, nothing dramatic has changed. They might still reach out, still come back the way they always have, still move between closeness and distance. But your response is different now, not because you are trying to be different, but because you see it clearly. You see the pattern as it happens. You recognize the cycle before it fully pulls you in, and that awareness creates distance, not physical distance necessarily, but emotional distance, the kind that allows you to observe without immediately reacting, to feel without immediately attaching. And in that space, something becomes undeniable. you realize that what you were holding on to was not them. It was the feeling, the possibility, the version of the connection that only existed in fragments. And once you separate that from reality, it loses its hold. You no longer feel the same urgency to respond, the same need to explain, the same instinct to keep things alive at all costs. And that does not come from indifference. It comes from alignment, from your actions finally matching what you understand. You begin to value consistency over intensity, clarity over potential, stability over emotional highs. And once those values shift, the dynamic that once felt impossible to leave no longer fits the same way it used to. And this is the part that people rarely talk about, the moment when you realize that even if they came back fully, even if they suddenly showed up in the way you once hoped they would, something inside you has already moved on from needing that. Because the version of you that needed that connection, that needed that validation, that needed that pattern to resolve itself is not the same version of you that sees it clearly now. You have already changed. And that change does not feel loud or dramatic. It feels quiet, almost simple, like a decision you did not have to force, like something that just became obvious over time. And with that clarity comes a different kind of freedom, not the kind where everything suddenly feels easy, but the kind where you are no longer pulled in directions that destabilize you, the kind where your emotional state is no longer dependent on someone else's inconsistency. You start to experience connection differently, not as something you have to maintain or protect at all costs, but as something that either exists in a stable way or does not exist at all. And that shift changes everything, because now you are not trying to make something work that was never aligned to begin with. You are allowing things to reveal themselves without forcing them into something they cannot sustain. And in that space, you begin to feel something you have not felt in a long time, not intensity, not anticipation, but calm, a kind of grounded clarity that does not spike and crash. That does not depend on external validation, that simply exists. And maybe the most unexpected part of all of this is not that you stop wanting them, it is that you stop needing them to come back in order to feel complete. Because for the first time, you are no longer trying to fix the past. You are no longer waiting for the pattern to resolve. You are no longer holding on to something that never fully held you in the first place. And when that realization settles in completely, when it becomes something you do not just understand, but actually feel, something shifts at the deepest level. Because now, if they come back, it no longer feels like relief. It feels like a choice. And maybe for the first time, you realize that you are no longer choosing them.